My dad called me a thief at Thanksgiving and slid a white envelope across the table in front of almost 30 relatives, like he had been waiting years to finally bury me with it. My mother was already crying before I even touched it. My cousin Mark was staring at me like he wanted to believe the worst, and the whole room had gone so still I could hear the football game in the next room. I'm Rowan Hale. I'm 38 and I work trauma care at Pine Ridge Regional Hospital, so I know what panic looks like. What scared me wasn't the accusation, it was how prepared my father was to make everyone believe it. But when I looked down at that envelope, I already knew something he didn't. 4 months earlier, I had started tracing the money, the debt, and the lie that had been growing inside my family since my grandfather, Walter Hale, died. And by the time that Thanksgiving dinner was over, the man calling me a thief was going to wish he had never said it out loud. To understand how my father thought he could do that to me in front of everyone, you need to see the house the way I saw it that night. It was Thanksgiving night in 2025 in Pine Ridge, Tennessee. The Hale house sat at the edge of town, where the paved road gave way to gravel and dark fields. It was the same two-story house my father had spent half my life insisting was the center of our family, the place every holiday came back to, whether people wanted to be there or not. By 5:30, the driveway was full. Pickup trucks lined one side, two sedans were parked in the grass, and somebody had left a folding chair on the porch because there was never enough room once everybody arrived. Inside, it smelled like roasted turkey, butter, brown sugar, sage, and the sweet edge of pumpkin pie cooling on the kitchen counter. The game was on in the living room. I could hear the announcer from the NFL broadcast through the low thump of conversation and the clatter of serving spoons against glass bowls. Someone laughed too loudly near the hallway. A kid ran past with a dinner roll in his hand and got hissed at by an aunt I had known my entire life and still never felt close to. I stood just inside the dining room for a second longer than I should have, holding the casserole dish I had brought from my apartment across town, and told myself to breathe normally. Pine Ridge was small enough that people remembered what you wore to church if it was unusual, small enough that your last name carried weight long after you were old enough to build a life separate from it. The Hales had lived there long before I was born. My grandfather Walter had owned land. My father owned visibility. That counted for a lot in a place like ours. Thomas Hale was already at the head of the table in a pressed button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms the way he did when he wanted to look relaxed and authoritative at the same time. He had that same public face on now, the one he used with clients at Hale Restoration and Remodeling, with men at church breakfasts, with bank officers, with anyone he needed to believe him. My mother, Diane, floated between the kitchen and the table with her nervous holiday smile, checking dishes, straightening napkins no one cared about, touching shoulders as if she could keep the whole evening from tipping sideways by physically holding it together. My younger brother Ethan sat 3 seats from the end, broad-shouldered in a dark flannel, staring into his glass of tea more than he looked at anyone. When his eyes met mine, the look was brief and tight. It was enough to tell me he was already bracing for something. I set the casserole down. My cousin Mark gave me a nod that never quite reached friendly. A few people said hello, a few did not. That was not unusual anymore. We had just started passing plates when my father tapped a spoon against his water glass. The room softened into silence in layers. First the adults, then the teenagers, then even the television felt farther away. He stood up slowly. "I need everyone to listen for a minute." No one moved. My mother stopped beside the sideboard, a dish towel still in one hand. My father looked around the table like a man preparing to say grace, except there was no warmth in him, just control. "There is something serious this family needs to address before we go any further." He reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and pulled out a white envelope. Even before he laid it in front of me, I felt every pair of eyes shift my way. My father placed the envelope beside my plate with deliberate care, as if he were setting down evidence in a courtroom. "Our daughter is a thief," he said. "She has taken money from this family, and I am done handling it privately." I heard one sharp inhale from somewhere down the table. My mother pressed her lips together, then her face folded exactly the way it always did when she wanted other people to see how deeply she was hurting. A second later, tears. My father kept going. "This is a court filing. If Rowan wants to keep pretending she has done nothing wrong, she can explain it to a judge." Across from me, Mark leaned back in his chair and stared. Two of my aunts exchanged a look over the sweet potatoes. Someone at the far end whispered, "Oh my God." I did not reach for the envelope right away. I looked at my father first. Then I looked at my mother. Then at Ethan, who had gone pale in a way that made him look younger than 35. Finally, I picked up the envelope and slid a thumb under the flap. The paper inside was cheap. I felt that before I even unfolded it. The print was too clean, too generic, the formatting wrong in a way most people at that table would never notice. But I noticed. I let my eyes move down the page once, then I folded it back up and set it beside my plate. My father crossed his arms. "Well?" His voice carried that hard edge I knew from childhood, the one that meant he expected the room to close around me and do part of the work for him. I kept my hands flat on the table. "This is not a real court document." A murmur moved through the room. One of my older cousins, who worked in real estate law in Knoxville, leaned across from 2 seats down and held out my hand. I passed him the paper. He scanned it, frowned, then lowered it. "This isn't filed," he said. "It looks like something printed off online." For one brief second, the room seemed to lose its footing. My father gave a short laugh that carried no humor. "So now we're arguing formatting instead of theft?" I could feel my mother's crying getting louder, not because she was more upset, but because the first version of this had not landed the way they expected. I sat back in my chair and folded my napkin once. "If everybody here wants to know what is actually happening, then you need to hear how this started." No one interrupted me, not even my father. I looked around the table, at my aunts, at Mark, at the faces that had known me my whole life and still looked uncertain, at Ethan, still silent, at my mother, frozen near the sideboard with tears on her cheeks, at my father standing at the head of the table as if the whole house belonged to him more than it belonged to anyone else. I've been waiting months for this conversation. That changed something in the air. Small, but real. Not enough to turn the room toward me, not yet, but enough to make them listen. I didn't come here to fight. I came here because the truth does not start tonight. It starts in 2015, when I signed one piece of paper for my father and spent the next 10 years paying for it. I rested my fingertips against the edge of the envelope. And if you want to understand why that matters, you need to know exactly what he asked me for back then, and why I said yes. Back then, I was 28, 3 months into my first full year as a nurse practitioner at Pine Ridge Regional Hospital, still getting used to hearing patients call me ma'am, and still checking my own badge some mornings like I needed proof I had really made it there. I was renting a small one-bedroom apartment over a hardware store on Main Street, driving a used Honda with a dent in the rear bumper, and putting money into savings every paycheck because I wanted what almost everyone in a town like Pine Ridge says they want in their late 20s: a little house, a fixed-rate mortgage, a porch with 2 chairs, something that was mine because I had earned it. My father called on a Sunday afternoon in April. "Can you come by the house?" I remember looking at the half-folded laundry on my couch and the anatomy review notes still stuck in one of my old binders, and thinking it sounded urgent but manageable, the kind of family thing you dealt with and then moved on from. When I got there, he was already at the kitchen table with papers spread in neat stacks. My mother was beside him with a coffee mug in both hands, worried before a word had even been spoken. My father tapped the top sheet. "The bank is giving me a hard time on the mortgage." He said it like the bank had personally offended him. "They're restructuring some things, and they want another name on the loan for a while." I sat down slowly. "For how long?" "Couple months," he said. "Maybe 6. This is procedural, that's all." My mother leaned toward me. "We'd never ask if it wasn't important." There are families where adult children are taught to ask questions first. Mine was not one of them. In my family, if your parents told you they needed help, the decent thing was to help, especially if you were the stable one, especially if you had the good job, especially if you were the daughter who did not make scenes. I looked over the paperwork. I understood enough to know what co-signing meant in broad terms, but not enough to understand what 10 years could do to a life if the wrong person stayed attached to it. My father slid a pen toward me. "I'll refinance you off as soon as this clears." I signed. The first year, nothing obvious happened. Then the second. Mortgage statements came, bills got paid, holidays passed, and every time I asked casually whether he had refinanced yet, my father gave me a version of the same answer: "Soon, after summer, when rates settle." By the time 2017 rolled around, I had started noticing how every conversation with money with him ended the same way, with me feeling unreasonable. That fall, he opened a home equity line of credit on the house. I did not know he had done it. I did not sit in a bank office and agree to it. I did not sign a fresh set of papers in front of anyone I trusted. I just lived my life and assumed the original promise still meant something. My name had never been removed from the original loan paperwork, and that house was still tied to my credit in ways I did not fully understand at the time. By the time I realized what that meant, the damage had already started. Then, in early 2018, I met with a lender in Cookeville after a 12-hour shift because I had finally found a small house I thought I could afford. The loan officer was polite until she opened the file. She frowned at her screen, clicked twice, then looked up. "Ms. Hale, there's an outstanding line tied to the property you co-signed on with a balance over $45,000. I thought she had the wrong person. There shouldn't be." She turned the monitor slightly. The address on the screen was my parents' house. I drove home in silence and called my father from the parking lot outside my apartment. "What is the HELOC?" There was a pause, then a quick breath through his nose. "That's an accounting issue. It'll be handled." "You use the house for a credit line and my name is still tied to it." "You're overreacting." "I'm trying to buy a home." "And you will," he said, "after this is cleared up." I wanted to believe that, because the alternative was admitting I had made a mistake that was now expensive enough to shape my future. An hour later, my mother called. "Your father is under so much pressure." I stood at my kitchen counter with my purse still on my shoulder. "Mom, he told me 6 months. It's been 3 years. He is trying." I said nothing. Then her voice changed, softer, smaller, the version she used when she wanted guilt to sound like love. "Families stay together when things get hard." So I let it go. That was how it kept working. Not with one giant betrayal, but with 100 smaller ones that all demanded patience from me and accountability from no one else. My credit alerts started arriving after midnight, like bad news that preferred darkness. My score dipped, then dipped again. I got letters I hated opening. One call from a collections department came while I was charting at work, and I had to step into an empty consult room to answer it with my hand over one ear, whispering that there had to be some mistake. Even my car loan changed. I refinanced at a worse rate than I should have gotten, and the man at the desk said it was because of debt exposure already on my file. Around the same time, something else went wrong in my life that made even less sense. My grandfather Walter stopped returning my calls. He had never been a phone talker, but he had always called back eventually. Then he didn't. I sent cards, left voicemails, dropped off a pie once, and was told by my father that Walter was sleeping and did not want visitors. A week later, I tried again. He doesn't feel up to company. Another time, my father said, "Honestly, Rowan, he's disappointed. He thinks all you care about lately is money." That one stayed with me because it landed exactly where it was meant to, on the bruise. For the last 3 years of Walter's life, I barely saw him. At church, people started asking strange little questions that never sounded like accusations until you heard what sat behind them. "Everything okay with your folks?" I heard there was some stress over property. At the hospital, Laura Medina from HR asked me to stop by her office one afternoon. The blinds were half open. She had a legal pad on her desk, and the careful expression people use when they do not want to seem like they are prying. "We've heard some personal concerns might be spilling into the community." "There isn't any legal dispute," I told her. She nodded. "I just needed to hear that from you." It embarrassed me more than I let show. Later that year, Ethan came by my apartment to help me move a bookshelf. We ended up standing in my kitchen drinking bottled water because neither of us was good at talking directly when it mattered. He kept glancing at the window. "Dad stays up late doing paperwork now." "What kind of paperwork?" He shrugged, then regretted speaking at all. "I don't know, financial stuff. He doesn't like anyone around when he's at the table." "You've seen it." "I've seen enough." "Then say something." His jaw tightened. "You know how he is." I did know. By the time Walter died in June of 2022, I had spent years learning how silence can be built for you by other people and then mistaken for peace. I was not called when he went into the hospital. I was not called the day his condition turned. I was not called until the funeral home had already set the visitation for the following evening. And when we gathered after the service to hear his will read, something about that room, that paperwork, and the look on my father's face made the first real crack appear in the version of events I had been living inside. I sat through the reading with my hands folded in my lap and the same numb pressure behind my ribs that I had felt since the funeral home called. The conference room at the law office was too cold, too bright, and too neat for what it was being used for. There was a framed painting of a red barn on one wall, a box of tissues on the table, and a tray of bottled water no one touched. Thomas sat closest to the attorney, shoulders squared, one ankle crossed over a knee like he belonged there more than the rest of us. My mother kept dabbing the corners of her eyes. Ethan looked down most of the time. When the will was read, most of Walter Hale's estate went to my father. The house, the land, the rental income, the liquid accounts after expenses. There were smaller distributions elsewhere, enough to make the document look balanced if you did not know the family. Ethan and I each received a modest amount, the kind of number that sounds respectful until you compare it to what stands beside it. I remember staring at the copy in front of me and thinking not that it was impossible, but that it was wrong in a way I could feel before I could prove it. My grandfather was many things: stubborn, proud, private, but he was not careless, and he was not sentimental in the selective way that will suggested. He did not spend my whole life telling me that land meant responsibility just to turn around and pretend I did not belong to any of it. I said almost nothing that day. My father did enough talking for everyone. Dad wanted to keep things simple. He said it with that practiced grief of his, low and steady, as though he were carrying a burden no one else could understand. Simple. That word stayed with me for months. Life moved forward because it always does, even when you do not feel caught up to it. I worked double shifts, I paid bills, I tried not to think about the part of my life that had folded in on itself around a dead man and a stack of paperwork. But once doubt starts, it does not stay quiet. It taps, it returns, it waits beside ordinary things. The call from Margaret Cole came in late August of 2023, on a Tuesday I had spent mostly on my feet. I almost let it go to voicemail because I did not recognize the number. "Rowan, it's Margaret." My great-aunt's voice was thinner than I remembered, but still direct. "I need to see you." We met the next afternoon at a small cafe off Court Street, where retirees lingered over coffee and high school teachers came in for sandwiches between shifts. Margaret was already there when I walked in, sitting near the window in a navy cardigan with a leather purse beside her and an envelope in front of her on the table. She did not waste time with pleasantries. I should have called sooner. I sat down across from her. "About what?" She laid one hand over the envelope. "Your grandfather showed me a different will." That was the first moment the room seemed to sharpen around me. She told me she had seen it not long before Walter's health declined for good. It divided things far more evenly. Thomas still received a substantial share, but so did Ethan and I. It sounded like my grandfather, not generous in a showy way, fair in the plain, deliberate way that had always mattered more to him. Margaret pushed the envelope toward me. Inside was a photocopy of an older will and 11 sealed letters, each one marked in my grandfather's handwriting. My name was on every envelope. My fingers shook when I touched the first one. Margaret watched me quietly. She asked me to hold on to those if anything got strange. Strange? Her mouth tightened. Thomas around money has always made me nervous. I opened one letter there at the table because I could not help myself. The paper was lined and yellowed at the fold. Walter's handwriting leaned slightly right, uneven but familiar enough that the sight of it made my throat close. He wrote that he missed me. He wrote that he did not understand why I had stopped coming around. He wrote that something in the house no longer felt honest. In another, he said he worried Thomas was too interested in matters that were not yet his to manage. In the last one I opened that afternoon, he wrote that if I was reading this, then he had run out of time to fix things himself. I sat there with my coffee untouched and felt the ground under the last 3 years of my life give way all at once. He had not turned away from me. Someone had turned me away from him. I left the cafe with the envelope in my bag and drove straight to the office of Benjamin Carter. Benjamin handled estate disputes and probate matters for half the county. His office was above a pharmacy on the square. He wore rimless glasses and had the kind of voice that made bad news sound measured instead of theatrical. He read through the copied will, looked over 2 of the letters, and asked for the probate packet from 2022. I brought it the next day. By the end of the week, he leaned back in his chair and said the only thing I needed to hear. If the signature is wrong or money moved improperly, this can be reopened. That was enough. I hired Rachel Kim first. What I thought would take a few weeks turned into months of records, waiting, follow-ups, and learning just how slowly the truth moves once money is buried inside family paperwork. She was a forensic accountant out of Nashville who worked quietly and did not waste words. Over several weeks, she traced account activity connected to my grandfather's estate and the house debt already tied to my name. When she came to Pine Ridge to show me what she had found, she spread the documents across the conference table in Benjamin's office in clean rows. 360,000 is the number I can support confidently. I looked at her. Moved where? She pointed with the capped end of a pen. business shortfalls connected to hail restoration and remodeling, credit card debt, a truck loan, renovation costs on my parents' house, transfers that were legal on paper only if the source had been legitimate to begin with. Nothing in me felt surprised anymore, just colder. Then I hired Dr. Melissa Grant, a document examiner in Knoxville. She compared the signature on the will filed in 2022 with verified samples from checks, tax records, and property documents signed by Walter Hale over the years. Her report came back in early spring of 2025. The signature on the will filed in 2021 did not match my grandfather's known hand. I read that sentence 3 times. That should have been enough to carry me to the next step. It was not. I still had to decide what the next step was. I was leaving my apartment one evening in September when Ethan's truck pulled in behind my car. He got out without shutting the driver's door all the way and stood there for a second, like he was trying not to turn around and leave. "I need you to hear something." We went upstairs. I did not ask questions until we were both in my kitchen. Ethan pulled out his phone and set it on the counter between us. "I recorded this last year." He said he had come by the house late one night to pick up a socket set he thought he'd left in the garage. He heard my father on the phone in the adjoining mudroom and hit record before he had time to think better of it. He pressed play. My father's voice came through thin but unmistakable. He was irritated, confident, careless in the way people get when they think no one important is listening. At one point, he said that I would never go through Walter's paperwork closely enough to understand what I was looking at. The recording ended. Ethan stared at the dark screen. "I should have brought it to you sooner." I let the silence sit for a second. "Why didn't you?" He looked down at his hands. "Because once I did, everything became real." A week later, I sat across from Benjamin again while he reviewed the reports, the copied will, the letters, and the audio file. Outside his window, the courthouse clock struck noon. He stacked the papers, tapped them straight, and looked at me. "If you want to confront him, do it where he can't control the room by moving people one at a time." I already knew what room that meant. By October, Thanksgiving was on the calendar at my parents' house, and for the first time in years, I said yes the moment I was invited. I arrived that evening with a casserole in one hand and a lever portfolio in the other, and by the time my father slid that fake court paper across the table, I had already decided I was not leaving that house with the truth still folded shut. For a second, after my cousin confirmed the document was not a real filing, no one seemed to know where to look. The football game still murmured from the living room. A fork hit a plate somewhere near the middle of the table. My mother stood frozen by the sideboard, one hand pressed to her chest, tears drying faster than they had come. My father recovered first, or tried to. This is exactly what she does. She grabs onto one detail and twists the whole story. I opened the portfolio beside my chair and laid the first report on the table between us. "No," I said, "this is what happened when I finally stopped taking your word for everything." The paper made a soft sound against the tablecloth, simple, clean, official in the quiet way real documents are. My father glanced at it and then away from it too quickly. "What is that supposed to be?" "A handwriting analysis." A few heads turned. Mark leaned forward from across the table. Ethan had not moved at all, but I could feel his attention like heat from the far end. I slid the report toward the center so more than one person could see it. Dr. Melissa Grant compared the signature on the 2021 will with verified signatures from Grandpa Walter's tax records, checks, and property documents. My father's mouth flattened. "This is ridiculous." I kept my eyes on the people around the table, not on him. Her conclusion is that the signature on the will filed after Grandpa died was not his. That landed harder than the fake summons had. You could feel it in the room, the kind of silence that is not empty at all, but crowded with people recalculating. My aunt, near the far corner, put on her reading glasses. Mark reached for the report and scanned the first page. My mother lowered her hand from her chest and stared at the table, as if the grain of the wood had suddenly become very important. My father let out a short laugh. So now you've hired people to write whatever you want written. Before I could answer, a chair scraped the floor. Margaret Cole stood up. She had barely touched her dinner. She had sat through the first part of the evening with both hands folded in her lap, looking older than she had at the cafe, but steadier too, as if she had already made peace with what this night was going to cost. Walter showed me another will. No one interrupted her. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila envelope, then removed a photocopy and held it with both hands. He showed me this before his health got bad. He told me exactly what he wanted, and it was not what got filed after he died. My father turned toward her sharply. "Margaret, you have no idea what you are talking about." She did not even look at him. "Yes, Thomas, I do." There was nothing theatrical in her voice. That made it stronger. He never told me he was disinheriting Rowan. He never told me he was cutting Ethan down to scraps. And he did not spend the last years of his life suddenly trusting you more than everyone else. My father stepped away from the head of the table and put one hand on the back of his chair. "That copy means nothing." "Maybe not by itself," I said, "so let's not stop there." I took out the second report. This one was thicker. Rachel Kim had tabbed the pages with small colored stickers, and I had read it often enough to know exactly where the clearest numbers lived. I placed it beside the first. Rachel Kim traced the movement of money connected to Grandpa Walter's estate and the debt already attached to my name. My father's face changed then. Not much, just enough. The first real crack. "You went through private financial records." "I went through what my attorney told me to go through." I turned one page and laid my hand over the lines so I could keep the room with me instead of burying them in paper. $360,000 was redirected. I spoke slowly because numbers move fast when people are trying not to hear them. Payments tied to hail restoration and remodeling, credit card balances, renovation costs on this house, a truck loan. Mark looked up first. "Thomas." It was the way he said my father's name that mattered, not the word itself. Less loyalty, more question. My father spread his hands. "I covered expenses for this family for years. With Grandpa's money." My voice stayed even. "With estate money that did not belong solely to you." Someone near the end of the table whispered, "Jesus." My mother sat down finally, not gracefully, just suddenly, like her knees had given her fewer options than she expected. I heard the television crowd roar from the other room after some play I would never remember. It sounded absurdly far away. My father was breathing harder now. "This is family business." "It became family business when you accused me in front of 30 people. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. That was when I looked toward Ethan. He already had his phone in his hand. He stood, and every person at that table turned toward him because Ethan almost never stood up in family arguments. He avoided them the way some men avoid mirrors. His voice was low, but it carried. "I heard this last year." He stepped closer and set his phone on the table. "I should have brought it sooner." Our father stared at him in disbelief that looked almost more wounded than angry. "Ethan." My brother did not answer him. He pressed play. The audio was thin and grainy, the kind of recording you have to lean into at first. Then my father's voice came through clear enough that no one in the room could pretend otherwise. He was talking to someone about paperwork, about control, about what I would or would not look into. Then the line that mattered. That I would never go through Walter's records closely enough to know what I was looking at. The room did not move while it played. No forks, no napkins, no low side conversations from the women nearest the kitchen. Even my mother stopped trying to manufacture grief. She sat with both hands in her lap and stared at nothing. When the recording ended, no one rushed to fill the silence. My father looked from Ethan to me, then to Margaret, then to Mark, then past all of us toward my mother, as if she might still help him gather the room back together. She did not. For the first time in my life, I watched Thomas Hale realize that the version of the story he had always controlled was no longer the only one in the house. By the spring after Thanksgiving, my life had become quieter in ways that still startled me. Not easier every day, not clean, not magically repaired, but quieter. The kind of quiet that comes when you stop waiting for the next lie to show up in your voicemail or at your front door wearing a familiar face. Benjamin Carter filed the petition to reopen Walter Hale's estate the first week of December. Rachel Kim's report went in with it. So did Dr. Melissa Grant's findings on the signature. I did not sit in court every day or spend my life in legal offices after that. Real life kept moving. I still worked shifts at Pine Ridge Regional Hospital. I still bought groceries, paid bills, and drove the same Honda with the dent in the bumper. But now there was a second track running under everything, one measured in filings, deadlines, signed affidavits, and waiting. The waiting was its own kind of labor. Benjamin kept me updated in short, practical calls. We're moving. The court accepted the supplemental filing. Thomas's counsel requested more time. That last part made me laugh once, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of thing my father would do when he no longer had control. Delay, reframe, hope time softened facts. It did not. Over the months that followed, parts of the estate were reviewed, questioned, and recalculated. Not everything came crashing down in one dramatic afternoon. That is not how this kind of thing works. It moved in increments: paperwork, depositions, corrections, accounting. But movement is movement, and for the first time in years, the movement in my life was not all one direction. A portion of the assets was set aside for redistribution. Some money was ordered returned. The claims against my father stayed civil, where Benjamin had expected they would, focused on misrepresentation and improper transfer rather than the kind of courtroom ending people imagine when they have only seen law through television. That was enough for me. I did not need handcuffs. I needed reality restored. In Pine Ridge, the fallout arrived the way weather does in a small town. Not all at once, not loudly, just everywhere. First Baptist Church never made a statement. Pastor Daniel Brooks did not call a meeting or deliver a sermon about truth and family sin. Pine Ridge is not that kind of place. Public judgment here usually sounds like politeness with the warmth removed. People stopped lingering with my father after Sunday service. Invitations thinned out. Phone calls got shorter. People who used to call my father for remodeling estimates started finding someone else. Men who used to clap him on the shoulder outside the fellowship hall started nodding from a distance instead. No one came to me with dramatic apologies. I did not get a parade of repentance at my apartment door. A few people spoke differently to me. A few looked embarrassed. Most simply adjusted their behavior and hoped that would count as enough. Maybe it did. Maybe it did not. By then, I no longer needed every person in Pine Ridge to tell me I had been right. I only needed them to stop helping him be wrong. My mother called twice in January and once in March. I answered once. She sounded smaller without an audience. I never wanted it to go this far. I stood in my kitchen with one hand around a mug of coffee gone cold. It was already far. There was a long pause. I was trying to keep the family together. By asking me to carry what he did, she cried a little then, but not in the familiar way. Less performance, more exhaustion. I believed she was hurting. I also believed she had made her choices. We did not fight. We did not heal on that phone call either. We just ended it in a place that felt honest. Ethan changed more than anyone. At first, he called to ask if Benjamin needed anything else from him. Then he called to ask if I wanted to get breakfast after my Saturday shift. We started meeting at a diner outside town where the coffee was burnt and the booths had cracked red vinyl seats. It was easier to talk in places that belonged to no one. One rainy morning in April, he pushed his plate aside and looked at me for a long second. I should have said something years ago. I watched a truck drag a trailer through the parking lot, tires hissing on wet pavement. You said it when you were able to. That still feels late. It was late, I said, but it wasn't useless. He nodded once and looked down. For a family raised on silence, that counted as almost everything. By the end of 2026, the practical parts of my life had started to look like the life I thought I might have had all along. My credit score climbed slowly, then steadily. The old drag from the house debt was finally gone. A lender who would have dismissed me 2 years earlier now shook my hand and walked me through numbers I could actually say yes to, without fear. The house I bought was not impressive. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, white siding that needed repainting in 3 places, a narrow front porch, and a patch of yard just big enough to make mowing feel like responsibility instead of punishment. It sat at the edge of Pine Ridge, where the road curved toward open fields. The day I got the keys, I unlocked the front door, stepped into the empty living room, and just stood there. No one else's debt, no one else's signature, no one else's version of who I owed my future to. I put a folding chair by the window that first night and ate takeout on my lap because I had not moved furniture in yet. The refrigerator hummed. A dog barked somewhere across the road. The place smelled faintly of fresh paint and dust, warmed by the furnace. It felt ordinary. That was the gift. For a long time, I thought family meant endurance. It meant being the reasonable one, the forgiving one, the one who stayed soft enough to be useful. I thought love required access, and loyalty required silence. I was wrong. Family is not the people who demand your peace as payment for their comfort. Family is the people who can live beside the truth. If you have ever had to choose between protecting the image of a family and protecting your own life, I would honestly like to know what that looked like for you. At what point did you set the boundary, and how did you know it was finally time?